Hey guys, tonight we're going way, way back. Like, older than your grandparents, older than Rome, older than pyramids. We're floating all the way to ancient Mesopotamia, so grab your blanket, dim the lights, and get ready for some nice, relaxing thoughts about mud. Because yes, mud is the star of tonight's story. We're talking about the Sumerians, the world's first real city people. The folks who looked around at the endless swampy mess between the Tigris and Euphrates, rivers, and thought, yep, perfect spot. Let's invent farming, writing, kings, taxes, and 100 new ways to make life miserable. Of course, they didn't think about it that way. They thought they were blessed by the gods, which is a nice way of saying, if you were a Sumerian farmer, your entire day was about mud, barley, and keeping your neighbors from stealing your water. So, tonight, let's drift into the daily grind of one of history's least glamorous jobs, being a farmer in the world's first cities. Now, Sumer wasn't exactly the Garden of Eden. It was more like the garden of too much salt in the soil and floods that arrive whenever they feel like it. But for some reason, people flocked here around 4000 BC. Why? Because the land did this thing where it could grow barley in giant quantities, and barley meant bread and beer, and basically survival. Of course, survival is relative. Being a Sumerian farmer meant your life was a careful balance between too much water and not enough water. The rivers would either flood your fields or abandon them to the sun, turning them into something resembling a cracked clay pot. So farmers built irrigation canals. Lots of them. Canals were the lifeblood of Sumer, and also the thing everyone argued about. You'd wake up at dawn, stumble out of your mud brick house, and check your patch of barley. The barley wasn't exactly luxurious wheat. It was more like the ancient equivalent of the cheapest off-brand cereal. Tough, reliable, and, if you brewed it right, it gave you a mildly intoxicating beer. Which was nice, because you probably needed it after a day of hauling water in 110-degree heat, and yes, heat. This was southern Mesopotamia. Summers were brutal. Shade was minimal. If you didn't start your work before sunrise, you'd cook like a clay tablet in the kiln. So what did a Sumerian farmer actually do all day? Mostly, you'd dig. You'd maintain canals. You'd pray for the canal not to collapse in on itself. You'd try to get your ox to plow straight lines in soil that was either mushy sludge or baked like concrete. And if you were lucky, you'd avoid stepping on one of the many charming thorns or snakes that loved the wetlands. Of course, you didn't own your land. Not really. That belonged to the temple, or the king, or some noble who collected rent. So after sweating through planting season, harvesting season, and every season in between, you'd haul your barley crop to the temple granary, and then hand over a hefty chunk of it as taxes. That's right, even in 3000 BCE, the taxman was waiting. You couldn't scroll TikTok to avoid him. You had to physically walk up and dump your grain in his storage room. What did you get in return? Well, technically, the god's protection, but practically, you got ration tokens. Little clay pieces that told you how much beer or bread you could pick up later. The Sumerians basically invented bureaucracy before they invented the wheel, which feels about right. Let's talk about houses. For a second, the average farmer's home was a cozy little box of mud bricks, maybe 2 rooms if you were lucky, roof made of reeds, furniture made of reeds, walls made of guessed it, more mud. If it rained too much, your house could literally melt. So yeah, don't get too attached to the interior design. Inside, you'd have a little oven for baking flat bread, some jars for storing grain, and maybe, if you were wealthy by farmer standards, a goat tied up outside. The goat wasn't just for milk. It was also your lawnmower, garbage disposal, and occasional burglar alarm. Clothing, nothing fancy. Wool if you could afford it, reeds if you couldn't. Summers were hot, so people went for lightweight skirts, sometimes just tufted sheep's wool wrapped around the waist like an ancient bath towel. Shoes, usually none, because what's better than spending all day ankle-deep in irrigation sludge than doing it barefoot? Food was functional. Barley bread, barley porridge, barley beer, sometimes onions, garlic, dates, and fish from the canals to spice things up. Meat was rare, unless your goat mysteriously died during a festival. Beer was thick and porridge-like, sipped through straws to avoid the floating gunk. Imagine breakfast smoothies, but all day, every day, forever. And before you think, wow, that sounds miserable, remember this was considered living the dream compared to wandering the desert and eating whatever roots you dug up. Religion was everywhere in daily life. If your canal collapsed, it wasn't because of bad engineering. Nope, it was because Enki, god of water, was in a bad mood. If your barley failed, clearly Ninhursag, goddess of the earth, wasn't pleased. So in addition to farming, you also spent plenty of time making offerings. Tiny clay figurines, bits of grain, and the occasional sheep if you were feeling extra devout. The temple was the big player in town. Temples weren't just for worship, they were also banks, storage facilities, and basically the HR department. For your entire existence, need rations, temple, need land, temple, need a priest to remind you your failures are cosmic punishment. Temple, again. So your daily routine wasn't just farming. It was farming plus making sure you didn't accidentally offend some god who could smite your harvest. A stressful way to live. But at least the beer kept flowing. Now. You might imagine Sumerian farmers as isolated peasants out in the fields. But no, they were plugged into city life. Towns like Uruk, Ur, and Lagash weren't small villages. They were bustling cities with tens of thousands of people, and they all needed food. So farmers had a kind of power, quiet power, because without them, everyone else would starve. But did they get respect? Not really. They were at the bottom of the social ladder. Kings at the top, priests just below, then scribes, merchants, craftsmen, and finally, youth the sunburnt guy, ankle deep in mud. At least you could look down on slaves, who had it even worse. Still, farming had its perks. You might not be rich, but you had a steady role in the grand cycle. Plant, pray, harvest, repeat, your life expectancy. Maybe 35 years, if the gods were kind, which wasn't long, but at least you'd leave behind plenty of clay tablets nobody would be able to read for another 4,000 years. Evenings was simple. After a long day, you'd collapse in your mud house, eat some porridge, sip barley beer, and maybe listen to someone recite an epic poem about Gilgamesh, the city's favorite overachiever king. Kids would play with clay figurines or wrestle. In the dust, adults would gossip about canal disputes, and everyone hoped tomorrow wouldn't bring a flood or a drought. And that, in the most unglamorous sense, was daily life. A cycle of mud, sweat, gods, and barley. The world's first farmers in the world's first cities. Irrigation drama, tax nightmares, and the temple economy all right. So we've set the stage with our Sumerian farmer waking up, trudging into the heat, and dedicating his life to barley and mud. But, as anyone who's ever lived near water knows, sharing it with neighbors is never peaceful. Welcome to the world of Sumerian irrigation drama. Because here's the thing, water was life. Without it, your fields dried up, your barley withered, and your goats gave you side-eye until they starved. Too much of it, and you had swamps that drowned your crops and turned your fields into mosquito heaven. So, naturally, people started building canals, and once you have canals, you have neighbors fighting over canals. Imagine this. You've just spent 3 months digging a trench to guide water to your barley. You're sweaty, you're sore, you've sacrificed more goats than you can afford. Then one morning, you discover your neighbor has accidentally redirected your canal to water his fields instead. Congratulations, you've just invented the world's first lawsuit. Yes, the Sumerians had laws about water theft. Hammurabi's famous code, which came later, has entire sections about it. But even before him, the Sumerians were writing complaints. On clay tablets, "Dear Temple, my neighbor blocked my irrigation channel. Please smite him." And the temple, being the wise overseer, would sometimes send inspectors. Other times, they just shrugged and demanded both of you pay more. Grain as a fine. Speaking of temples, let's float into their role. If the farmer was the donkey hauling the load, the temple was the cart, sitting on top of him, demanding more weight. Temples in Sumer weren't just spiritual hangouts. They were economic, juggernauts. First, they owned land. Tons of it. Fields stretching as far as the eye could see. Farmers like you often worked on temple land, technically as tenants, which meant you owed the gods a share of your crops. And by the gods, of course, I mean the priests managing the temple, Granary.Second. Temples acted like central banks. They stored surplus grain in massive mud brick warehouses. In theory, this helped stabilize food supplies during drought years. In reality, it meant the priests had the power to decide who ate and who starved. Nice gig, if you can get it. Third, temples issued rations. You didn't exactly get a paycheck in coins. Instead, you got clay tokens, little marked pieces that said, "This entitles you to X liters of barley beer." Imagine being paid entirely in grocery vouchers. But the grocery store is run by people who claim divine authority. Now. Let's not forget the kings. Sumerian kings weren't exactly absolute monarchs in the later sense. They were more like glorified city managers with godlike PR campaigns. A king's job was to make sure the gods were happy, the canals stayed open, and the taxes kept flowing. Notice the order there. Gods first, water second, you last. Kings also loved to stamp their names on canal projects. Anytime a new waterway was dug, you can bet there'd be an inscription saying something like, "King Urananch built this canal for the glory of Enki." Never mind that thousands of sweaty farmers actually dug it. The king got the credit, and you got a sunburn. Still, kings weren't entirely useless. They organized massive canal cleaning events, basically the ancient equivalent of mandatory community service. If you didn't show up to help dredge the sludge out of the waterways, you could lose your land rights. So imagine the whole city, out there knee-deep in mud, cursing under their breath, while priests reminded them this was all for the gods. Now, let's zoom in on the economy a little more. If you think farmers were free to just farm what they wanted, nope, barley was king. Wheat was too fragile for the salty soil, so barley became the default. Over time, so much irrigation salted the ground that even barley struggled. Archaeologists literally tracked soil salinity through ancient records, and you can see the yields dropping. Farmers were basically salting their own future, while desperately trying to survive the present. So what did you do when your land went bad? You abandoned it. Sumerian cities have records of fields being written off as useless, and people moving to new plots, which is great for short-term survival, but not exactly sustainable when your entire civilization is stuck between two rivers with nowhere else to go. And this is where the tension starts to simmer, because farmers were bearing the brunt of environmental collapse, while priests and kings kept demanding their grain quota. Picture yourself hauling barley sacks to the temple, knowing your family barely has enough to eat, and still being told to give more because Enlil requires it. Very motivating _life. Wasn't all doom though. Festivals broke up the monotony. Sumerians loved a good party. Religious festivals often included music, dancing, and, most importantly, beer. Lots of beer. Farmers might spend weeks saving up just to splurge during a festival, because for a brief moment you could forget the mud and taxes. Also, markets existed. Farmers didn't live entirely off rations. You could trade extra fish, dates, or reeds for small luxuries, maybe a copper tool, or if you were fancy, a little jewelry for your spouse. But remember, money wasn't really a thing yet. Most trade was barter, so you'd stand in the market trying to convince someone that your goat was worth 3 baskets of onions. Good luck with that negotiation. Let's drift into the daily work cycle a bit more. Sumerian farming followed the rhythm of the rivers. Spring planting, summer growth, fall harvest, winter repair. During planting, you'd scatter barley seeds, then drag a log across the field to press them in. Simple but effective. During harvest, you'd cut stalks with sickles made of flint or copper. Labor was backbreaking, but efficient enough to support tens of thousands of city dwellers who never touched a plow in their lives, and who did all this work. Families, men, women, children, everyone pitched in. Kids weren't in school learning cuneiform unless you were the child of a scribe. No. Farmer kids learned how to herd goats, weed barley, and shovel mud. Childhood was short, and playtime was usually mixed with chores. Ancient Mesopotamia, the place where family bonding meant irrigating a canal together in the blazing sun. Let's not forget the darker side, forced labor. If the king needed extra manpower, or if you owed too much tax, you could be conscripted into work gangs. These weren't exactly chain gangs, but they were exhausting. You might spend months hauling bricks for a temple or dredging a canal far from home. Your family had to cope without you, and if you died from heat stroke, well, the gods had chosen it. Very convenient theology. Slaves also played a role. Many were war captives, forced to labor in the fields or temples. Others were locals who fell into debt. Debt slavery was common. Miss your tax payment, and suddenly your daughter is working at the temple for the next decade. For farmers, debt was a constant shadow. One bad harvest, and you could lose everything. Now, let's gently float to the topic of writing. Because while farmers were slogging in the fields, scribes were inventing cuneiform, clay tablets with wedge-shaped marks. And what were most of these early tablets about? Farming, taxes, rations. It's almost depressing. Humans invented writing. And the first thing we did was create spreadsheets. Your life as a farmer might be recorded on clay X, barley ode from Wisefield, delivered to the temple of Z. Thousands of these still exist. So ironically, while farmers themselves left almost no personal stories, their labor is preserved in the world's oldest paperwork. The original receipts, or it didn't happen. Even with all this hardship, there was pride. Farming wasn't glamorous, but it was sacred. Feeding the city was seen as divine duty. Hymns were written praising farmers as the backbone of civilization. Sure, you were exhausted, broke, and perpetually muddy, but you were also part of something bigger. The world's first civilization, and maybe, just maybe, that thought kept you going. Along with the beer, definitely the beer. So, to recap this little dreamy drift, irrigation made farming possible, but also made neighbors into enemies. Temples and kings demanded their share, often more than you could spare. Daily work was relentless, with cycles of planting, harvesting, and repairing. And while festivals and markets gave small joys, debt and labor obligations loomed over every farmer's head. Life was harsh, but it was also organized, structured, predictable in its misery, which, in a strange way, made it perfect for building cities. Because, without farmers keeping the barley flowing, none of the other shiny Sumerian inventions, like writing, epic poetry, or ziggurats would have existed. Families, marriages, and the goat next door. So far, we've trudged through mud, argued over canals, and handed too much grain to the temple. But what about home life? What was it actually like being part of a Sumerian farming family? Spoiler, less romance, more contracts. Because, in ancient Sumer, marriage wasn't about love. It was about survival, alliances, and making sure someone was around to help dig the canal. The gods might have blessed unions, but let's be honest, father probably arranged it with your neighbor over a jug of barley, beer, Marriage, Sumerian stylia, typical marriage, began with negotiations. Families bargained over dowries, livestock, grain, maybe a few tools. The bride's family usually provided goods, while the groom's family promised support. Nothing says lifelong devotion quite like haggling over goats. Once the deal was struck, the union was sealed with an official contract. On clay, of course, because in Sumer, if it's not written on a tablet, it didn't happen. A typical contract might say, X gives his daughter to Y as wife. Y agrees to provide her with food, clothing, and oil. Simple, practical, and refreshingly free of poetry. Weddings themselves, not extravagant. There might be a small feast with bread, beer, maybe some roasted fish if people were feeling festive. But no grand white dresses, no dramatic speeches, just some neighbors gathered, the families nodding at each other, and everyone hoping the new couple produced children quickly. Family roles. So what did everyday family life look like? Men were expected to handle the heavy labor, plowing, digging, hauling. Women managed the household, baking, weaving, brewing beer, raising kids. But don't think women were passive. Brewing beer alone gave them economic importance. Beer was a staple ration, and women controlled its production. Imagine being in charge of the city's most important supply chain. Pretty powerful, even if nobody carved your name into a ziggurat. Children's lives were short and practical. Few toys beyond clay figurines or red whistles. From an early age, kids joined their parents in work. Girls learned to grind grain. Boys followed their fathers to the fields. Education was reserved for the elite sons of scribes or priests. For farmer families, the only school was the field, and the only test was whether your barley survived the season. The household set-up houses were mud brick rectangles, sometimes with a courtyard in the middle. 2 rooms if you were modest, 3 or 4 if you were slightly better off. Families often shared space with animals, goats, sheep, maybe a donkey if you were prosperous. The animals weren't just food sources, they were integrated into daily life. Picture your goat wandering into the kitchen while you're kneading bread. Perfectly normal. Furniture was minimal. Reed mats for sitting, clay jars for storage, maybe a wooden chest if you were lucky. Lighting was oil lamps, which filled the rooms with smoke. Privacy was almost non-existent. Family life was communal, noisy, and filled with the smell of baking bread mixed with animal dung. Cozy in a rustic way. Domestic. Worklets glide through the rhythm of a farmer's wife. She'd rise at dawn, grind barley into flour using a heavy stone quern. Hours of back-breaking, grinding just for a few loaves of bread. She'd knead the dough, bake it in a clay oven, and maybe flavor it with onions, if the market had some that week. After that, brewing beer was next. Women soaked barley, let it ferment, then stored it in clay jars, sealed with reeds. Weaving was also constant. Wool from sheep had to be cleaned, spun into thread, and woven on upright looms. Clothes wore out quickly, especially when your life involved sweating in mud canals. So weaving wasn't a hobby, it was survival. Add in childcare, fetching water, keeping animals fed, and you've got a non-stop workload. Modern complaints about having it all pale compared to ancient multitasking. Marriage. Troubles now, not all marriages went smoothly. Ancient contracts show that divorce was allowed, though not exactly equal. Men could dismiss a wife with relative ease, sometimes returning her dowry, sometimes not. Women, on the other hand, needed strong grounds, neglect, abuse, or failure, to provide. If a husband failed to give food and oil, the wife could technically leave. Adultery was taken seriously, especially for women. A married woman caught with another man could face harsh punishment. Men, of course, were judged less strictly, because double standards are apparently as old as civilization itself. Polygamy existed, though not widespread. Wealthier men, sometimes, took multiple wives or concubines. But for the average farmer, feeding one wife and several kids was already a challenge. One wife was plenty, children and inheritance children weren't just little bundles of joy. They were your labor force, your old age insurance, and your legacy. Sons inherited land, tools, and sometimes debts. Daughters were often married off, becoming bargaining chips in new alliances. Infant mortality was high. Families had many children, expecting some wouldn't survive. It was tragic, but normalized. Rituals and charms were common, amulets hung in cradles, prayers whispered to protective gods, anything to improve a child's odds. If a father died, inheritance was carefully divided, usually with the eldest son taking the largest share. Disputes were common, because nothing brings out sibling rivalry like fighting over barley fields. Pets and animals, goats, sheep, and donkeys were everywhere. Goats provided milk and meat, sheep gave wool, donkeys hauled goods. Dogs existed too, mostly as guard animals. Cats, not really. Mesopotamia wasn't Egypt. Cats didn't have celebrity status here. Animals often lived in close quarters with Humans. Archaeological remains show pens built into courtyards and floors layered with compacted dung. Not glamorous, but practical. Waste could be dried and used as fuel, since trees were scarce. So yes, cooking dinner with goat dung briquettes was absolutely a thing. Underscore, social ties and neighbors' family extended beyond the household. Kinship networks mattered. Cousins, uncles, and in-laws all pitched in during harvests or crises. Community was survival. Neighbors helped repair canals or build houses. Of course, they also stole water and borrowed tools they never returned. Some things never change. Marriage strengthened these networks. Your spouse wasn't just a partner. They were a link to another family. So when disputes arose over land, water, or dowries, they weren't just personal squabbles. They involved entire kin groups, sometimes escalating into city-level conflicts. Festivals and domestic joys, despite the grind. Life had small joys. Family gatherings during festivals were lively. People dressed in their cleanest wool skirts, shared bread and beer, and listened to musicians play lyres. Children laughed, adults gossiped, priests reminded everyone of divine obligations. Storytelling was a big part of family evenings. Epics, myths, fables recited aloud in rhythmic tones. The Epic of Gilgamesh, or shorter tales about gods tricking each other, were entertainment and moral lessons. Think of it as bedtime Netflix, minus the screen. Death and ancestors' death came early, but it didn't end family obligations. Ancestor worship was common. Families buried relatives under the floors of their houses or in small courtyards. Daily life continued literally above the graves of parents and grandparents. Offerings were made bread, beer, small trinkets to keep the ancestors happy. So family life extended beyond the living. You didn't just live with your parents, children, and goats. You also lived with the bones of past generations under your feet. Comforting, in a slightly unsettling way, the farmer's world in balance. In short, the Sumerian family was a unit of survival. Marriage was a contract, kids were future laborers, and goats were practically roommates. Roles were strict but interdependent. Everyone contributed, from grinding grain to dredging canals. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't romantic, but it was steady. A rhythm of bread, beer, weaving, and muddy chores. And in a world where the rivers could flood without warning, that stability was worth everything. City life, markets, and the scribal overlords sow, weave. Had our farmer trudging through mud, brewing beer, and arguing over goats. But farmers didn't live in total isolation. They were connected to the great humming organism of the Sumerian city. And that's where things get even more bureaucratic. Because if you thought mud was exhausting, wait until you meet a Sumerian scribe. The rise of the cities by 3000 BCE, places like Uruk, your Lagash, and Nippur weren't just villages. They were booming cities with tens of thousands of people. Pictures sprawling mud brick houses, towering ziggurats, bustling markets, and streets, filled with donkeys braying at each other. For a farmer, the city was both exciting and intimidating. On market days, you'd trudge in with baskets of barley or fish. You'd pass walls carved with inscriptions you couldn't read, see palaces you'd never enter, and maybe hear rumors about wars between kings of cities you'd never visit. The city was dazzling and a little suffocating. Markets and trade markets were the beating heart of Sumerian urban life. Farmers brought in their surplus grain, onions, garlic, dates, reeds, fish. Craftsmen sold tools, pots, textiles, and trinkets. Merchants traded goods from far-off lands, copper from Oman, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, wood from Lebanon. Barter was the norm. A farmer might trade barley for fish, or reeds for a pot. But over time, silver became a standard unit of exchange, though still rare in daily transactions. Most people measured value in barley. Barley was currency, paycheck, and survival, all rolled into one. Markets were noisy. Donkeys braying, vendors shouting, kids running underfoot. Everyone haggled, because no one ever thought a goat was really worth just one jar of oil. And, in the background, temple officials wandered around, making sure taxes were collected. Even in the market, you couldn't escape the granary's reach. Craftsmen and specialists. City life depended on more than farmers. Craftsmen were everywhere: potters, weavers, metalworkers, carpenters. They lived in workshops, often attached to their homes. Work was family-run, fathers teaching sons, mothers teaching daughters. Pottery was constant. Farmers needed jars to store grain and beer. Weavers produced endless wool skirts and red mats. Metalworkers shaped tools from bronze, once copper, and tin started mixing together. Then there were bakers, brewers, and butchers. Bread, beer, and meat had their own specialists. You could, in theory, bake your own bread, but city life allowed for outsourcing. If you had enough barley rations, you could pay someone else to do the kneading. Civilization, where laziness became possible, the scribal class. Now, let's talk about scribes, because if farmers were the backbone of Sumer, scribes were the paperwork-obsessed brain. Scribes were trained from childhood in special schools, called Edabar, the tablet house. Boys, almost never girls, learned cuneiform, memorizing thousands of symbols. Their education was brutal. Teachers beat mistakes out of them with sticks. The reward for all that suffering, a lifetime of writing tax receipts. Congratulations. But scribes had status. They were literate in a world where 99% of people weren't. That meant they controlled records, land sales, marriage contracts, ration lists, myths, hymns. If something needed to be official, it went through a scribe. For farmers, scribes were a necessary evil. You couldn't argue with them because they literally defined the official version of events. If a dispute over a canal reached the temple, a scribe wrote the judgment, and once it was baked into clay, it was permanent. Your muddy complaint became immortal, whether you liked it or not. Scribes also loved showing off. Many tablets contained little boastful notes, like, "The student of the tablet house is excellent," or "The teacher is wise and strong." Basically, the world's first humble brags, priests and temples in the city. Priests were everywhere, too, not just in the ziggurat, but also managing the city's bureaucracy. They collected offerings, supervised workers, and led festivals. Priests weren't cloistered mystics, they were administrators in wool skirts, and temples were giant economic machines. Imagine a combination of church, courthouse, warehouse, and welfare office. That was the Sumerian temple. Farmers brought grain there, craftsmen delivered tools, scribes filed documents, priests redistributed rations. Religion and economics weren't separate, they were the same thing. Festivals were when temples flexed. Huge processions, music, feasting, and sacrifices. Ordinary farmers loved festivals finally. a break from endless labor. Kids got treats, adults got drunk on beer, and everyone forgot for a day that they owed half their barley to Enlil. City politics and petty war. Sumerian cities weren't one big happy family. They were rivals. Uruk fought with Kish, Lagash with Oma. You're with everyone at some point. Wars weren't massive clashes, they were small-scale raids, often about water rights. For farmers, this meant your life could suddenly be disrupted by conscription. One year you're planting barley, the next you're carrying a spear in a raid against the city next door. Not that it mattered much. Most wars ended with someone carving a victory stele and everyone going back to farming. Still, kings loved to brag about their conquests. They'd carve inscriptions saying, "I, mighty king, defeated Umma and took their canals." Never mind that the soldiers were exhausted farmers who just wanted to get home to their goats. City layout and daily life. So, what did a city actually look like? Picture narrow winding streets lined with mud brick houses, no fancy street grids, just organic growth. Courtyards were shared, animals wandered freely, and waste often got dumped right in the street. Not exactly fragrant. The ziggurat towered over everything. A massive stepped pyramid of mud bricks, painted with bright colors. It wasn't just a temple, it was a symbol. You could see it from miles away. A constant reminder that the gods and their priests were watching. Palaces were less common in early Sumer, but kings eventually built them. Large compounds with storerooms, courtyards, and audience halls. But don't imagine marble or gold. Mud brick again. Always mud brick. Stone was rare and imported, so most of the great buildings were just taller piles of dirt. Entertainment and culture life in the city wasn't all work. Music was popular: lyres, harps, drums. Archaeologists even found a famous lyre of yore, decorated with gold and lapis. Ordinary folks didn't own such treasures, but they had simpler instruments for festivals and family gatherings. Games were common too. The royal game of yore, a board game with dice, was played by elites and commoners alike. Think of it as the Mesopotamian version of backgammon. Perfect for a quiet evening after the fields. Poetry and myths circulated orally. Farmers might not read, but they knew the tales. Gods arguing, kings boasting, heroes wrestling, monsters. It was all recited in a sing-song rhythm. A perfect lullaby after a long day. Crime and punishment, of course. With big cities came crime, theft, assault, and canal disputes filled court records. Punishments, varied fines, forced labor, even execution. In severe cases, but most disputes were settled through restitution. You stole my goat, pay me back to goats. Simple, effective, slightly awkward at dinner parties. Contracts were everywhere. Marriage, land sales, loans, all written in clay, and once baked, they were eternal. Some farmer's petty argument with his brother-in-law is still sitting in a museum today. Immortality by bureaucracy. Farmers in the urban machine. For the farmer, the city was both opportunity and burden. It gave markets, festivals, and access to tools, but it also meant taxes, conscription, and endless paperwork. Without farmers, the city couldn't exist. But without the city, farmers had no temple support, no organized irrigation. It was a codependent, sometimes toxic relationship, and so the daily life of the Sumerian farmer wasn't just about plowing barley. It was about navigating an entire social web. temples demanding offerings, scribes recording every move, kings demanding loyalty, neighbors stealing water, and the occasional donkey clogging the street. Civilization was exhausting, but at least it kept you from wandering the desert eating cactus roots, dust, shadows, and the Sumerian afterlife. So we've slogged through barley fields, argued over canals, and bargained in noisy markets. But farmers weren't just concerned with daily survival. They also spent a lot of time worrying about the one thing none of us can really dodge: death. And let me tell you, the Sumerians were not optimistic about what came next. A gloomy outlook, unlike later religions that promised paradise if you behaved. The Sumerian afterlife was, well, kind of a cosmic waiting room with no exit. They called it the Kua, sometimes translated as the Great Below. Everyone went there. Kings, farmers, priests, even that neighbor who stole your irrigation water. Death was the great equalizer, but not in a cheerful way. The dead existed in a shadowy underworld ruled by Ereshkigal, the goddess of death. Her realm was described as dark, dusty, and dreary. No sunshine, no feasts, no harps, just endless wandering, eating clay and drinking dirty water. Sounds cozy, and unlike, say, Egyptian pharaohs, Sumerians didn't build elaborate tombs stuffed with treasures. The afterlife wasn't something you could buy your way into. Rich or poor, your fate was the same: dust snacks. Forever, _ancestor. Care, but that didn't mean the living could ignore the dead. Quite the opposite. Ancestors had to be cared for. Most Sumerian families buried relatives under their own houses, not in some faraway cemetery, but literally beneath the floor where you lived. Imagine eating dinner above Grandpa's skeleton, comforting in its own way. The living had to make offerings: bread, beer, water. If you neglected your ancestors, they were believed to grow restless and haunt you. Nobody wanted a cranky ghost hanging around, so families poured libations into clay pipes leading down to the burial chamber. It was like an ancient drive-through service for the dead. This daily or monthly ritual kept the ancestors appeased. In return, the dead were thought to help protect the family like ghostly security guards, as long as you fed them. Funeral rites. Funerals themselves were modest. The body was washed, anointed with oils, wrapped in cloth, and buried with small goods: a jar of beer, a loaf of bread, maybe a favorite tool, enough to get you started in the shadow world. Professional mourners might be hired women who wailed and sang laments, because even 4,000 years ago, no funeral was complete without someone crying dramatically in the background. But there was no grand promise of eternal bliss. Funerals were about respect, obligation, and making sure the dead transitioned smoothly. Beyond that, it was out of your hands. Gods and human fate. The gloomy afterlife fit neatly into Sumerian religion, which painted the gods as powerful but not exactly benevolent. The gods had created humans, according to myth, to do the hard work they didn't want to bother with. That meant farming, canal digging, and generally keeping the world running. Humans were servants in a cosmic household, and the gods were the landlords who never fixed the leaks, but always collected the rent. Prayers and offerings weren't about love, they were about survival. Keep the gods happy, or they'll send drought, floods, or plagues. Farmers spent as much energy appeasing divine moods as they did plowing their fields, and when death came, the gods didn't swoop in with rewards. They just shrugged and sent you to Ereshkigal, harsh, but at least consistent, underscore festivals. And religious comfort, of course. Not everything in religion was bleak. Festivals gave people moments of joy and connection, processions of statues, music, dancing, feasting. It felt like the gods visited the city in person. During New Year festivals, for example, rituals reenacted myths of fertility and cosmic renewal. Farmers hoped this would guarantee good harvests. It was the closest thing to optimism the Sumerians had. Maybe the gods would notice your devotion and give you one more year of barley. Still, festivals didn't erase the existential dread. They just softened it with beer, music, and temporary hope. Underscore, the Epic of Gilgamesh and existential angst. If you want a snapshot of the Sumerian worldview, look no further than their greatest story, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, sets out on a quest for immortality after watching his friend Enkidu die. He journeys through deserts, fights monsters, meets wise sages, and eventually finds the one man who survived the Great Flood. That man has eternal life. Lucky him, but Gilgamesh. He fails. He falls asleep at the wrong moment, loses the plant of immortality, and returns home empty-handed. The moral: no matter how powerful you are, death wins. For farmers listening to this tale by the fire, it was both depressing and relatable. If even kings couldn't escape dust, why would a barley farmer stand a chance? The lesson wasn't to fight death, it was to accept your mortal lot, enjoy bread and beer, and keep your fields watered while you could. Underscore omens and divination still. Sumerians loved to peek into the future. Diviners studied sheep livers, stars, or even oil patterns on water to predict the gods. Moods by farmers might consult omens before planting or harvesting. If the gods hinted at disaster, what could you do? Double your offerings, sacrifice a sheep, and hope for mercy. It was less about changing fate, more about bracing yourself for whatever came. Omens didn't promise happiness, they just gave you a heads up about your next round of suffering. Underscore. Life as preparation. With such a bleak view of eternity, daily life became even more important. Work, family, and rituals were the main focus. Survival was meaning. Feeding your children, honoring ancestors, keeping the gods from flooding your fields, that was the point. There wasn't much emphasis on individual legacy. Sure, kings built monuments and scribes immortalized their names. But ordinary farmers, their immortality was in their family line, in the descendants who poured beer into clay pipes long after they were gone. It wasn't glamorous, but it was continuity. Underscore dreams of escape, that said. Not everyone accepted the gloom quietly. Some myths speak of special individuals who became semi-divine, escaping the dreary afterlife. Heroes, priests, or kings might gain special favor, but these were exceptions, not promises. For the vast majority, the shadow world was inevitable, which might explain why Sumerians invested so heavily in ritual, storytelling, and festivals. If eternity was grey and dusty, then this life needed all the music, beer, and lyre playing it could get. Underscore death in the fields for farmers. Death often came suddenly. Disease, heat stroke, accidents in canals. When someone died mid-harvest, neighbors gathered to help bury them, then finished the work so the family wouldn't starve. Community softened the blow, and when night fell, with oil lamps flickering, families whispered prayers to the ancestors. Below the floor. Because while eternity was bleak, at least the dead were close. Not in heaven or hell, but literally under your feet. Underscore. Dust to dust. So, the Sumerian farmer's view of death was simple, if not exactly cheerful. You lived in mud, you farmed barley, you appeased the gods, and when you died, you joined your ancestors in the shadowy dust. No promises of paradise, just continuity, obligation, and the hope your children would keep pouring beer into that burial pipe. It sounds grim, but there's also a kind of peace in it. No illusions, no false promises, just the steady rhythm of life, death, and duty. The same rhythm that had carried families for generations and would continue long after. Collapse in slow motion when the barley gave up. So, we've watched our Sumerian farmer trudge through mud, pray to unhelpful gods, and try to ignore the ghosts under his floor. But even barley, the ultimate survivor grain, has limits. And by around 2100 BCE, those limits were being tested in ways that spelled long-term trouble for the world's first cities. Because the truth is, farming in Mesopotamia was always a fragile balancing act. Too much irrigation salted the fields. Too little water starved them. And climate shifts added another layer of stress. If you've ever left a plant on your windowsill too long and killed it despite your best efforts, multiply that by an entire civilization. Underscore. The salty soil problem. We've touched on this before, but let's slow down and soak in the details. Irrigation in Sumer pulled water from the rivers into the fields. Great for the barley, but the water also left behind salts in the soil as it evaporated. Over years, that salt built up. Wheat had already disappeared from the region centuries earlier because it was too sensitive. Barley hung on, but even barley began to falter. Archaeologists have found records on clay tablets showing crop yields steadily declining. Barley, that once yielded 30 grains for every seed sown, dropped to just 10, then 5. That's farming math you don't want. Farmers tried rotating fields, abandoning exhausted plots, or switching crops. But the land was finite, and the population was big. When your main food source is literally poisoning itself, things spiral. Quickly. Climate throws a curveball, as if salinization wasn't enough. Around 2200 BCE, the climate in the Near East shifted. A long drought struck the region. Rainfall declined, river levels dropped, and canals dried out. Fields turned from muddy patches to cracked clay pans. For farmers, this meant disaster. You could pray to Enki, you could sacrifice sheep, you could bribe priests with extra onions. None of it made the rains come. The drought hit at the worst possible time, when Sumerian fields were already weakened by salt. It was like pushing a sick donkey into a desert, and then wondering why it collapsed. Famines and migrations. With failing crops came famine. Clay records show increasing debt slavery, families forced to sell children or themselves to survive. People abandoned farms and migrated north, where rainfall was more reliable. This northward drift helped new powers, Rissacadians, Assyrians, Babylonians, while southern Sumer struggled. Cities like Ur and Lagash shrank. Some never recovered. The countryside emptied as farmers packed up their red mats and hoped the grass really was greener somewhere else. And in Sumer, grass wasn't greener. It was usually just salty dust. The fall of Ur. One of the clearest examples of collapse is the fall of Ur, one of Sumer's greatest cities. Around 2004 BCE, Ur was sacked by invading Elamites from the east. But honestly, Ur was already wobbling before the invasion. Its economy was brittle, its food supplies strained, and its farmers exhausted. There's even a heartbreaking poem, The lamentation over the destruction of Ur. It describes the city's fall in mournful tones, temples abandoned, fields silent, gods leaving their shrines. People genuinely believed their deities had abandoned them, which, to be fair, is how it must have felt when your harvest failed year after year. Slow. Not sudden. It's important to remember that Sumer didn't vanish overnight. Collapse wasn't a dramatic apocalypse. It was slow, uneven, and messy. Some cities declined while others staggered along. Farmers kept farming as long as they could, but over centuries, power shifted northward, and the old Sumerian heartland turned into a shadow of its former self. For the farmer, this meant generations of struggle. Your grandfather might remember bumper harvests. Your father might recall smaller ones. You grew up thinking famine years were normal. Collapse was a lived experience stretched across centuries. A long, frustrating decline where each generation lowered its expectations. The human cost. So what did this mean for daily life? More debt, more forced labor, more children sold to cover grain shortages. Families fractured under the weight of survival, and the psychological toll must have been immense. Imagine being told every drought was the god's punishment, every famine proof that Enlil was angry. You kept making offerings, kept sacrificing goats, but nothing improved. At some point, faith must have felt like shouting into the wind. Of course. Priests had answers, more rituals, bigger sacrifices, stricter devotion. Kings had answers too. Wage wars to secure new lands, build bigger canals. Everyone doubled down on the same strategies that had created the problems. Very on brand for human history. The north rises as southern fields salted out. Northern Mesopotamia became the new agricultural center. Rain-fed farming was easier there and less dependent on elaborate canals. Akkadians and later Babylonians built on Sumerian traditions but left the salty fields behind. The Sumerian language itself eventually faded, replaced by Akkadian. Scribes still learned it, but like Latin in medieval Europe, it became a scholarly tongue rather than a living one. The farmer who once cursed in Sumerian over a collapsed canal would, centuries later, be cursing in Akkadian instead. Progress, I guess, legacies of a struggled, spite collapse. The Sumerians left an astonishing legacy, writing legal codes, ziggurats, myths all, born out of those muddy fields. Even their struggles taught lessons. Later Mesopotamian societies managed irrigation more carefully, aware of the dangers of salinization, though, spoiler, they didn't always succeed either. For the humble farmer, though, legacy wasn't the point. He just wanted his barley to sprout, his children to eat, and his ancestors to stay quiet under the floor. Collapse wasn't an abstract concept. It was empty grain jars, abandoned fields, and long walks north. Civilization in the dust. So, in the end, the daily life of a Sumerian farmer was always precarious, balanced on mud, salt, and water that didn't behave. For a few centuries, it worked. Cities flourished, temples grew fat, kings carved their names on canals. But eventually, the system cracked. The legacy of mud and barley. So, here we are, at the end of our slow wander through the lives of the world's first city farmers. We've walked their muddy fields, shared their barley beer, peeked into their gloomy afterlife, and watched their civilization decline grain by grain. But the story doesn't end in the salty fields of southern Mesopotamia, because Sumer, even in collapse, planted seeds, intellectual ones that kept sprouting long after the last farmer abandoned his plot. The gift of writing. Let's start with the most obvious legacy, writing. Cuneiform was invented not for poetry, but for farming. Farmers needed receipts, temples needed ration lists, and kings needed tax records. The earliest tablets are simple. Tallies, so-and-so, delivered 3 jars of barley to the temple of Inanna. Hardly thrilling stuff. But from those clay spreadsheets grew the entire written tradition of Mesopotamia, laws, myths, literature, without Sumerian farmers trudging their barley to the temple. Scribes wouldn't have needed to invent symbols to track it. No barley, no writing, no Gilgamesh. And without Gilgamesh, literature as we know it would look very different. All because of farmers and their stubborn grain. The city as a concept. Sumer also gave the world the city. Not the idea of people gathering together. Villages existed elsewhere, but the full package. Urban centers with temples, palaces, markets, and bureaucracy. The farmer, hauling barley into Uruk, was part of a grand experiment. Could humans live together in dense, organized communities? Could food surplus feed specialist scribes, potters, priests who didn't farm themselves? The answer was yes. Messy, unequal, and sometimes collapsing in famine, but yes, and that. Urban experiments spread everywhere. From Babylon to Athens, from Rome to modern Megara. The DNA of city life traces back to Sumerian mud bricks. Agriculture as a system. Sumerian irrigation was flawed, salty soils and endless disputes. But it was also revolutionary. They turned floodplains into food engines. They created schedules for planting and harvesting, rules for sharing water, systems for storing surplus. Even when those systems cracked, the model remained. Later, Mesopotamians improved irrigation, learned crop rotation, and managed salinity better. The lessons of failure mattered as much as the successes. So, the next time you look at a modern irrigation canal slicing across farmland, remember it's a direct descendant of some tired Sumerian farmer's trench in 3000 BCE. The principle hasn't changed. Humans moving water where it doesn't want to go. Law and bureaucracy, another legacy. The joyless but essential invention of bureaucracy. Farmers may not have loved scribes tallying their barley, but those records laid the groundwork for law codes. Contracts, court disputes, debts all written, all standardized. By the time Hammurabi carved his famous code centuries later, he was standing on Sumerian shoulders. The principle that society needs: written rules, enforceable contracts, and predictable consequences, that started in those dusty cities where farmers fought over irrigation channels. Of course, for the farmer, bureaucracy meant more receipts and more taxes. But for us, it meant civilization could scale beyond one village chief's memory. Paperwork, or rather, claywork, made complex society possible. Myth and meaning. And then there's mythology. The gods of Sumer, Enlil, Inanna, Enki, Ereshkigal didn't vanish when their fields failed. Their stories echoed into Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian traditions. Gilgamesh survived as the world's first epic. The flood story of Utnapishtim became the template for Noah. Farmers sitting in their courtyards, listening to tales of gods arguing and kings failing, unknowingly preserved archetypes we still tell today. Every time a modern story wrestles with mortality, hubris, or the futility of seeking immortality, it's replaying the themes of a Sumerian farmer's bedtime tale. underscore, underscore, the forgotten farmers. But here's the quiet irony. Kings' names survive Gilgamesh, Yunamu, Hammurabi. Priests' temples survive, at least as ruins. Scribes' tablets survive in museums. But the farmers themselves, the men, women, and children who bent their backs in the mud year after year, they remain anonymous. We can reconstruct their lives from bones, houses, and receipts, but we don't know their names. Their stories were too ordinary for scribes to record, too repetitive, too common, and yet their labor was everything. Without them, there's no city, no temple, no ziggurat, no epic. Civilization was their unintended side effect. All they wanted was to survive another season. Instead, they carried humanity into history. The end of Sumer, the beginning of Usbai. The time the last Sumerian cities faded, their cultural seeds had already spread. Akkadians took their gods and writing. Babylonians took their laws. Assyrians took their urban models. Persians, Greeks, and Romans, centuries later, stood on a foundation built by farmers who just wanted their barley to grow. So, in a way, Sumer never truly ended. It became invisible, absorbed into everything that came after. Every bureaucrat filing forms, every canal diverting water, every crowded city with temples and markets. That's Sumer. So let's end where we began, with the farmer himself. He wakes before dawn, ties a wool skirt around his waist, and steps barefoot into the mud. He guides his ox along the field, checks the canal, worries about salt in the soil. His wife grinds grain, brews beer, and weaves cloth. His children chase goats, fetch water, and learn by doing. At midday, the sun is unbearable. He takes a break, sips beer thick as porridge, and mutters a prayer to Enlil. In the evening, he returns home to a small courtyard house. He eats bread, listens to a neighbor tell a story about Gilgamesh, and pours a little beer into the pipe for his ancestors. It's not glamorous. It's not heroic, but it's life. The steady, repetitive, exhausting rhythm that allowed cities to rise and history to begin. So, as we drift off tonight, think of those farmers, not as nameless drudges, but as the quiet architects of everything that followed. Their barley fields fed the first cities. Their irrigation canals carved the blueprint of civilization. Their myths and rituals seeded the stories we still tell. They didn't know they were building history. They just wanted bread, beer, and enough water to keep their fields alive. But in that endless struggle with mud and salt, they gave us writing, law, cities, and myth. The legacy of Sumerian farmers isn't in monuments or victories. It's in the idea that human life, even in its most ordinary, repetitive form, can shape the entire course of civilization. So tonight, as you close your eyes, picture the soft lapping of irrigation water in a clay-lined canal, the hum of insects in the fields, the smell of baking bread, and the low murmur of prayers rising from a mud-brick courtyard. The world's first farmers, tired and dusty, carrying on. Civilization began in their hands, and it still rests, in some way, in ours. Good night.